his reserve planes were rearmed so that he could deliver the killer blow. But Nagumo's plan was already going awry. Nagumo had based his decision to postpone launching his planes until they were all ready on information he'd received from his scout plane. His own fleet was here. The report from the scout plane put the American ships here. At this distance, Nagumo knew his carriers were out of reach of the American planes. The problem was Nagumo's scout plane was wrong. The American fleet was actually here, their planes within range. And unknown to Nagumo, American bombers from these ships were already on their way towards him.
At 9:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were spotted by the inexperienced aircrew in the American torpedo bombers. Despite their limited training, they had no choice but to attack. The American pilots bravely held their course towards the carriers. They'd hunch low and prayed they'd make it through the storm of anti-aircraft fire coming from the ships. As they roared down towards the Japanese carriers, they were pounced on by a pack of patrolling Zeros. The lumbering American planes were no match for the agile Zeros. 35 of the 41 torpedo bombers were shot down above the Japanese fleet, most of them without even releasing their torpedoes. Those that did, missed. The attack had been a disaster. They'd failed to score a single hit.
Nagumo was almost ready to make his move. His deck crews had been working hard to rearm and refuel his planes. If they could be launched quickly, the Japanese would surely win the Battle of Midway. At 10:21 a.m., Nagumo and his men were still not quite ready to launch their planes.
At precisely that moment, American dive bombers like this one appeared high above the Japanese carriers, and their bomb run was clear. The Japanese fighters that should have dealt with them had been drawn off to attack the American torpedo planes. There was nothing to stop these dive bombers as they began screaming down towards the decks of the Japanese carriers.
A lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late.
There was no stopping the Americans now. 4 bombs ripped into the carrier Kaga. And another struck Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. But even as the dive bombers were attacking the Kaga and Akagi, another group of American planes, these from the Yorktown, arrived from a quite different direction. The Japanese fighters, already overstretched by the first attacks, didn't know which way to turn. Within moments, these fresh American bombers dived on a 3rd Japanese carrier, the Soryu. They slammed 3 bombs into her. Relatively few bombs had been dropped by the Americans, but their impact was devastating. 3 of Japan's great carriers were destroyed.
On board the 3 Japanese carriers, there was chaos. Aircraft, fuel tanks, and ammunition exploded, sending fireballs and huge chunks of metal flying through the air. All 3 carriers were turned into flaming wrecks. Many of their crews suffocating in the smoke, trapped below decks that glowed red hot.
A gush of hot air washed over me. We were hit hard. As fire spread, heaps of bombs began to explode with shattering blasts. I could see, not far off, the Akagi and the Soryu. They too were aflame. It was a terrible scene.
Nagumo survived the attack on the Akagi, but was forced to abandon his burning flagship. In little more than 5 minutes, the Americans had struck 3 times into the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy at its moment of maximum vulnerability. But all was not lost for the Japanese. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was untouched. And now, 18 dive bombers and 6 Zeros from this one surviving Japanese carrier were sent to search out and destroy the American ships. They were amongst the last remnants of Nagumo's huge force, but these few Japanese pilots were deadly professionals, unlikely to miss their targets.
Intent on revenge, the pilots from the Hiryu soon spotted what they were looking for. An enemy carrier. It was the USS Yorktown. The crew of the Yorktown were horrified to see the Japanese bombers approaching. They'd been hit by the Japanese before at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but this time they were prepared. The experience of the Coral Sea had taught them vital lessons in damage control, which they immediately put into action.
The 5-inch guns opened up first with loud cracks. Then came the rumble of multiple guns. The enemy bombers and fighters were under intense anti-aircraft fire from all the automatic weapons. The sky was black from shell bursts. Red tracers laced the sky. Japanese planes were falling, trailing fire, and exploding as they hit the water.
Anti-aircraft guns put up an effective barrage which destroyed many of the approaching Japanese planes. But 7 of the bombers made it through. They dodged the wall of flak coming from the carrier and dropped their bombs. They scored 3 direct hits. The bombs ripped through the flight deck and exploded deep in the heart of the ship, snuffing out the boilers. The Yorktown slowed to a halt. It seemed like it was all over for the Yorktown. But the Yorktown's crew were not going to give up that easily. Deep below decks, the engineers struggled to get the ship going again. But the boilers were wrecked. Thick black smoke poured into the intense heat of the engine room, choking the men. For over an hour, they worked against the odds, fixing the boilers. And by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Yorktown was operational again, making about 20 knots.
Reports from their pilots that an enemy carrier had been destroyed began to revive Japanese hopes. A second attack force was quickly launched from the Hiryu to find and destroy another of the American carriers.
At 2:40, the Hiryu's second strike force arrived and launched another devastating attack on the Yorktown. The mighty ship had taken all that she could, and soon she was listing to port. Her crew had to abandon ship.
The Battle of Midway was now to end with one final act of destruction. The Japanese believed they'd sunk 2 of the 3 US carriers. They didn't realize they'd hit the Yorktown twice. They now thought that they were fighting on equal terms with the Americans, with just one surviving carrier each. Based on this misapprehension, the commanders on the Hiryu now made an almost unbelievable decision. For the next 90 minutes, the battle would be put on hold.
The surviving Japanese pilots on the Hiryu had been up since before dawn, and they were exhausted by the day's constant flight operations. They were barely able to function. So now that it was thought there was only one remaining American aircraft carrier left to sink, the men were told that they had time to take a rest and grab a bite to eat. It was a final, fatal miscalculation.
Things were not nearly so relaxed aboard the two American carriers. The American commander, Admiral Spruance, knew that he had to find the one remaining Japanese carrier and strike it before its aircraft could strike back at his ships. And then in mid-afternoon, Spruance got his chance. One of his scout planes had located the Hiryu. At 3:30, Spruance launched his dive bombers to finish the job and avenge the Yorktown.
90 minutes later, the dive bombers appeared high above the wooden flight decks of the Hiryu and began their high-speed dives heading towards the middle. In quick succession, 4 bombs smashed into the Hiryu. They penetrated the flight deck and turned the bridge into an inferno. The last remaining Japanese carrier was on fire.
Yamamoto's ambitious Midway battle plan had ended in catastrophic failure. With his carriers gone, he'd lost vital air superiority over the Americans. He still had his big gun battleships, but they were little more than white elephants in this new era where aircraft reigns supreme. Yamamoto ordered his ships back to Japan. Just over a dozen American bombs had destroyed the cream of the Imperial Japanese fleet and altered the course of the war in the Pacific.
At the Battle of Midway, America lost just over 300 men and 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Japanese losses were far more severe. Around 250 planes had been destroyed, 4 carriers had been sunk, and 3,000 men had been killed. Years of combat experience and training had been wiped out. The aircraft carrier reigned supreme, but Japan had just lost the very men it needed to wage this kind of warfare.
Japan's naval power never recovered from its defeat at Midway on June the 4th, 1942. America built a whole new fleet of aircraft carriers, but it took 3 more years of bloodshed before the Japanese surrendered here on the USS Missouri, now moored in Pearl Harbor, where the war had all begun. Japan had been a stubborn enemy and only at last admitted defeat when America delivered the final blow: atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which launched the world into the nuclear age. Next time, the Battle of Stalingrad. Over 60 years ago, a battle was fought in this Russian city that would be the turning point of the Second World War. It was one of the hardest fought battles of all time.
I'll be revealing what it was like for the German and Soviet soldiers who fought street by street and building by building.
And I'll be explaining how the leaders' tactics drove their own armies to the brink of destruction.